The American taxpayer has funded billions of dollars in this effort, and enough is enough. The president's frustrated. His patience is running very thin.
Karoline Leavitt got a lot of hate for making this statement about the Ukraine war, and for good reason. She only proved what everyone was thinking about the Trump administration's ignorant and unapologetic stance regarding the war. However, something unexpected happened. President Zelenskyy would not let Karoline's dangerous rhetoric go unanswered. Let's talk about his reply. The tense relationship. At the heart of this tension is a contentious Oval Office meeting that took place in February 2025, which was intended to be a productive discussion about an economic minerals deal between the United States and Ukraine. However, what should have been a diplomatic engagement quickly deteriorated into what observers have described as a heated exchange between President Zelenskyy, President Trump, and Vice President J.D. Vance. During this pivotal meeting, Trump and Vance reportedly accused Zelenskyy of being ungrateful for U.S. aid and unwilling to negotiate peace with Russia. This confrontation would set the tone for what would become an increasingly fraught relationship between the Ukrainian government and the Trump administration, with White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt playing a central role in articulating the administration's position in ways that Zelenskyy would later characterize as dangerous. Following this meeting, Leavitt made several public statements that sharply criticized Zelenskyy's approach to peace negotiations. She described the Ukrainian president as rude, antagonistic, and ungrateful to the American taxpayer, assertions that were not merely offhand remarks, but represented the official position of the Trump administration regarding Ukraine's leadership. In a particularly pointed comment that received significant media attention, Leavitt claimed that Trump figuratively and literally ate President Zelenskyy's lunch, referring to Trump's decision to cancel a planned lunch due to what she characterized as Zelenskyy's uncooperative behavior. She further suggested that this confrontational attitude from the Ukrainian president had derailed a potential economic agreement that would have benefited both Ukraine and American taxpayers. In a recent press briefing, Leavitt doubled down on this criticism, stating,
"And unfortunately, President Zelenskyy has been trying to litigate this peace negotiation in the press, and that's unacceptable to the president."
She continued with an even more direct critique of Zelenskyy's approach to peace talks.
He wants to do what's right for the world. He wants to see peace. He wants to see the killing stopped. But you need both sides of the war willing to do that. And unfortunately, President Zelenskyy seems to be moving in the wrong direction.
These statements reflect a fundamental shift in the U.S. approach to the Ukraine-Russia conflict under the Trump administration. While the previous administration had positioned itself as a steadfast ally of Ukraine in its resistance against Russian aggression, the current administration appears to be prioritizing a swift conclusion to the conflict, even if that might require Ukraine to make significant concessions. This policy shift became increasingly evident as Leavitt continued to emphasize the Trump administration's focus on ending the war through negotiations rather than through continued military support. She frequently highlighted President Trump's commitment to ending the Russia-Ukraine war, suggesting that a ceasefire deal could be imminent despite Zelenskyy's apparent reluctance. In one notable statement, Leavitt told reporters, "We have never been closer to peace," citing progress in ceasefire talks facilitated by the U.S., including a 30-day ceasefire proposal that Ukraine had reportedly accepted, but that was still awaiting Russia's response. She emphasized NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's praise for Trump's efforts in breaking the deadlock through diplomatic initiatives in Saudi Arabia. Yet beneath these optimistic declarations about progress toward peace lay a more complicated reality. While Leavitt portrayed Zelenskyy as the obstacle to peace, the Ukrainian president was simultaneously grappling with ongoing Russian aggression, including a ballistic missile strike on his hometown, Kryvyi Rih, in April 2025, which killed 4 people and injured 17. From Zelenskyy's perspective, the Trump administration's pressure to accept a ceasefire without adequate security guarantees or territorial integrity represented not just a diplomatic challenge, but an existential threat to Ukraine's future. This fundamental disconnect in priorities and perspectives would fuel the growing tensions between Zelenskyy and Leavitt, setting the stage for the Ukrainian president's eventual characterization of her statements as dangerous. The dynamic between Zelenskyy and the Trump administration became even more strained when former President Trump publicly claimed that Zelenskyy shared responsibility for starting the war, alongside Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden. Trump criticized Zelenskyy's competence, suggesting he had miscalculated by engaging in a war Ukraine could not win. This assertion prompted a forceful response from Zelenskyy, who accused the Trump administration of justifying Russia's invasion. The Ukrainian Ukrainian president went so far as to invite Trump to visit Ukraine to witness the destruction firsthand, a gesture that some U.S. officials reportedly viewed as confrontational and as potentially escalating tensions with a key ally. These exchanges highlight the profound divergence in how each side frames the conflict. For Zelenskyy, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its subsequent full-scale invasion represent clear acts of aggression against which Ukraine has every right to defend itself. For the Trump administration, as articulated by Leavitt, the priority is ending the conflict quickly, with an emphasis on pragmatic compromises that might require Ukraine to accept certain painful realities. When questioned about whether the U.S. had asked Ukraine to give up Crimea as part of negotiations, Leavitt responded,
well, as President Trump rightfully pointed out in that statement, it was President Obama who gave up Crimea, who allowed Russia to take it over in 2014. And so the president is not asking Ukraine to recognize Crimea. Nobody has asked them to do that.
However, she immediately pivoted to emphasize the need for compromise.
What he is asking is for people to come to the negotiating table recognizing that this has been a brutal war for far too long. And in order to make a good deal, both sides have to walk away a little bit unhappy.
This statement encapsulates the fundamental tension in the U.S.-Ukraine relationship under the Trump administration. While not explicitly demanding that Ukraine recognize Russian control of Crimea, the administration's push for mutual concessions and a quick resolution inherently pressures Ukraine to consider territorial compromises that Zelenskyy has consistently rejected as violations of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Adding another layer of complexity to this diplomatic tension, Leavitt's youth and relative inexperience have become points of contention. At 27 years old, Leavitt is the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, a fact that has drawn both admiration for her rapid ascent and criticism regarding her qualifications for such a pivotal role in communicating U.S. foreign policy. Her communication style, characterized by unwavering loyalty to Trump and a combative tone toward critics and the media, has earned her descriptions as slick, pugnacious, and fiercely loyal. However, incidents like her verbal slip during a press conference where she said Trump had exuded effort in the Russia-Ukraine war instead of exerted have fueled perceptions of inexperience and raised questions about her command of the complex diplomatic issues at stake. Now, let's explore. Zelenskyy's characterization of Leavitt's statements as dangerous stems from his concern that they undermine Ukraine's negotiating position, potentially embolden Russia, and signal a weakening of U.S. support for Ukraine's sovereignty. The statements deemed dangerous. While the exact quote from Leavitt that Zelenskyy labeled as dangerous isn't explicitly cited in our sources, several of her public comments have been particularly contentious and align with what Zelenskyy would likely find threatening to Ukraine's position. Let's examine these statements and their implications. One of the most problematic aspects of Leavitt's rhetoric from Ukraine's perspective has been her persistent framing of Zelenskyy as the obstacle to peace. In a press briefing, she stated,
"These should be closed-door negotiations. The president's national security team, his advisors, have exuded significant time, energy, and effort to try to bring this war to an end."
She continued with an assertion that directly challenges Ukraine's agency in determining its own future.
The American taxpayer has funded billions of dollars in this effort, and enough is enough. The president's frustrated, his patience is running very thin.
This public expression of frustration, suggesting that the U.S. might withdraw support if Ukraine doesn't comply with Trump's push for a swift resolution, represents precisely the kind of statement that Zelenskyy would view as undermining Ukraine's negotiating position with Russia. By publicly expressing the administration's impatience, Leavitt effectively signals to Russia that the U.S. may not maintain its support for Ukraine indefinitely, potentially emboldening Putin to hold out for more favorable terms. Zelenskyy has consistently rejected outcomes from U.S.-Russia talks that excluded Ukraine, arguing they undermined Kiev's agency. From his perspective, Leavitt's statement suggesting that Ukraine should quickly accept compromise solutions without adequate security guarantees fundamentally threaten Ukraine's sovereignty and long-term security interests. Another concerning aspect of Leavitt's rhetoric has been her characterization of Zelenskyy's leadership and negotiation stance. During a press briefing following the February 2025 Oval Office meeting, she claimed that Zelenskyy was unprepared to discuss peace and instead focused on security guarantees, which she described as derailing the intended economic partnership. Her quip that Trump ate Zelenskyy's lunch highlighted the meeting's collapse and publicly humiliated the Ukrainian Ukrainian president at a time when maintaining a united front against Russian aggression was crucial. This type of public criticism of an ally fighting an existential war against a common adversary would be considered highly unusual in traditional diplomacy. From Zelensky's perspective, such statements not only damaged his personal standing, but also played into Russian propaganda narratives that portray Ukraine as uncooperative and unreasonable in peace negotiations. Perhaps most alarming from Ukraine's standpoint have been Leavitt's statements suggesting that Trump's administration might be pursuing a peace deal that could disadvantage Ukraine. When asked about Trump's specific expectations for Ukraine in terms of territorial concessions, Leavitt avoided providing details, stating that negotiations were ongoing. This lack of transparency regarding the parameters of potential peace terms left Ukraine anxious about what might be negotiated without its full participation or consent. The potential implications of these statements become clearer when considered alongside Trump's own remarks, questioning Ukraine's role in peace talks and suggesting shared responsibility for the war. Together, they create a narrative that appears to pressure Ukraine into concessions that could benefit Russian interests. This dynamic was on display when Leavitt expressed frustration with Zelensky's stance on peace talks, stating on April 23, 2025, that he was moving in the wrong direction. This characterization, which echoed Trump's own remarks, suggested growing impatience with the prolonged conflict and implied that Zelensky's approach to negotiations was the primary obstacle to peace. For a leader defending his country against an aggressor that has annexed territory, killed thousands of civilians, and repeatedly violated ceasefires, such statements would naturally be perceived as not just insensitive, but potentially dangerous. By placing the burden of compromise primarily on Ukraine, rather than on Russia as the aggressor, Leavitt's rhetoric risks normalizing territorial conquest through military force and undermining the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity enshrined in international law. Furthermore, Leavitt's description of Zelensky as rude, antagonistic, and ungrateful to the American taxpayer, coupled with her suggestion that Trump's patience was running thin, carries an implicit threat of reduced or withdrawn U.S. support. For a country heavily dependent on U.S. military aid to defend against a larger aggressor, such statements represent an existential threat, potentially signaling to Russia that Ukraine's international backing is weakening. Zelensky's sensitivity to these remarks must also be understood in the context of ongoing Russian attacks, such as the ballistic missile strike on his hometown, Kryvyi Rih, in April 2025. Against the backdrop of continued civilian casualties, Leavitt's statements pressing Ukraine to quickly accept peace terms could be seen as callously disregarding the human cost of Russian aggression and the legitimate security concerns of the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian president's labeling of Leavitt's remarks as dangerous likely reflects his concern that they undermine Ukraine's negotiating leverage by publicly pressuring Kyiv to concede to Russian demands, such as recognizing territorial losses like Crimea, signal a potential U.S. withdrawal of military support, as evidenced by reports of Trump pausing aid after the Oval Office fallout, and embolden Russia by framing Ukraine as uncooperative, aligning with Moscow's narrative that Zelensky is an obstacle to peace. The impact of these statements extends beyond diplomatic tension. They have concrete implications for Ukraine's ability to defend itself and negotiate from a position of strength. By publicly suggesting that U.S. support might be contingent on Ukraine accepting certain terms, Leavitt's statements effectively weaken Ukraine's hand in negotiations while strengthening Russia's. In response to criticism of her approach, Leavitt has maintained that her statements reflect Trump's commitment to prioritizing American interests and ending the war. She has argued that Zelensky's refusal to engage in Trump's proposed deals, including the minerals agreement, was a missed opportunity for economic prosperity and peace. She has also framed the public nature of the Oval Office clash as a transparent display of Trump's frustration with what she called Zelensky's hard-headedness. However, this defense fails to address the fundamental asymmetry in the conflict. Ukraine is the victim of aggression, not an equal party in a business dispute. Treating the war as a deal to be negotiated rather than an illegal invasion to be resolved according to international law fundamentally mischaracterizes the nature of the conflict and potentially sets a dangerous precedent for how territorial disputes might be resolved globally. This approach to diplomacy aligns with broader criticisms of Leavitt's communication style. Her tenure as White House press secretary has been marked by accusations of prioritizing Trump's narrative over facts and adopting a combative approach toward the press and critics. This approach may resonate with Trump's base domestically, but creates significant challenges in the delicate realm of international diplomacy, where nuance and consistency are crucial. The tension between Zelensky and Leavitt also reflects a deeper ideological divide in how each views the nature of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. For Zelensky, it is an existential struggle for national survival and the defense of democratic values against authoritarian aggression. aggression. For the Trump administration, as articulated by Leavitt, it is increasingly framed as a distant conflict that primarily serves as a drain on American resources, with an emphasis on swift resolution over just outcomes. Now, let's explore how these tensions have played out in the broader context of the U.S.-Ukraine relations under the Trump administration, examining the potential implications for the future of the conflict and international security more broadly. Implications and future prospects. The growing friction between Zelenskyy and the Trump administration represents far more than a personal disagreement. It signals a fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy toward Ukraine and potentially toward the rules-based international order more broadly. This shift carries significant implications for how conflicts are resolved and for the precedents that might be set regarding territorial conquest in the 21st century. One of the most immediate and concerning implications is the impact on Ukraine's military position. Reports suggest that Trump paused military aid to Ukraine following the contentious Oval Office meeting in February 2025. This development, combined with Leavitt's public expressions of the administration's frustration, creates precarious uncertainty for Ukrainian forces defending against Russian aggression. For a country heavily dependent on international support to sustain its defense capabilities, any reduction in military aid could have catastrophic consequences on the battlefield. This vulnerability is precisely what makes Leavitt's statements so potentially dangerous from Zelenskyy's perspective. They signal to Russia that Ukrainian support might be wavering, potentially emboldening Putin to intensify military pressure rather than engage in good-faith negotiations. The Trump administration's approach, as articulated by Leavitt, appears to prioritize a swift end to the conflict over ensuring a just and sustainable peace. This emphasis on expediency carries significant risks. Historical evidence suggests that peace agreements imposed without addressing the underlying causes of conflict or ensuring adequate security guarantees often lead to renewed hostilities. By pushing Ukraine to accept terms that may compromise its sovereignty and security, the administration risks setting the stage for future conflicts rather than establishing lasting peace. Moreover, the public nature of this diplomatic tension has strategic implications. By airing grievances and frustrations through press briefings and social media, both sides risk undermining the confidentiality and trust essential for effective negotiations. Leavitt's criticism that Zelenskyy has been trying to litigate this peace negotiation in the press, ironically, comes in the context of her own public statements about the administration's dissatisfaction with Zelenskyy's approach. This public discord also sends mixed signals to allies and adversaries alike. NATO partners, who have coordinated their support for Ukraine, may question the reliability of U.S. leadership if its position appears to shift dramatically. Meanwhile, Russia may be incentivized to continue its aggression in the hope that Western unity will fracture further, potentially allowing it to achieve through diplomatic pressure what it has struggled to secure on the battlefield. The tension between Zelenskyy and Leavitt also reflects broader challenges in U.S. foreign policy under the Trump administration. Leavitt's approach to diplomatic communication, characterized by direct criticism of allies and a transactional view of international relations, represents a significant departure from traditional diplomatic norms. While such an approach may resonate with domestic audiences, it creates unique challenges in navigating complex international crises. Looking forward, several scenarios could emerge from this diplomatic standoff. First, the pressure from the Trump administration could indeed push Ukraine toward accepting compromises it has previously rejected. If Zelenskyy concludes that the alternative is losing U.S. support entirely, he might reluctantly engage with proposals involving territorial concessions or limitations on Ukraine's future security arrangements. This outcome would likely be presented by Leavitt and the administration as a diplomatic victory, but could set a dangerous precedent regarding the use of force to revise international borders. Alternatively, Zelenskyy might maintain his principled position despite U.S. pressure, potentially seeking to strengthen ties with European allies to offset any reduction in American support. Trump has consistently maintained that Europe needs to do more to support Ukraine, and a reduction in U.S. aid might indeed prompt increased European commitments. However, this scenario risks a more fractured Western response at a time when unity is essential. A third possibility is that domestic political calculations in the United States could influence the administration's approach. If polling indicates that a significant segment of voters, including some in Trump's base, support continued aid to Ukraine, the administration might moderate its position despite the current rhetoric. Leavitt's statements would then serve more as negotiating leverage than as indicators of imminent policy changes. Whatever scenario unfolds, the implications extend far beyond U.S.-Ukraine relations. The resolution of this conflict will establish important precedents for how the international community responds to territorial aggression. If Russia secures significant concessions through its invasion, other authoritarian regimes might be emboldened to pursue similar strategies, potentially destabilizing destabilizing regions across the globe. The tension between Zelenskyy and Leavitt also highlights profound questions about the nature of alliances and support in modern international relations. The Trump administration, through Leavitt's statements, has increasingly framed U.S. support for Ukraine in transactional terms, describing it as writing blank checks and emphasizing the cost to American taxpayers. This approach contrasts with traditional conceptions of alliances based on shared values and strategic interests. For Ukraine, navigating this new terrain requires careful diplomacy. Zelenskyy's public criticism of Leavitt's statements as dangerous reflects both genuine concern about their implications and a strategic attempt to rally domestic and international support against any pressure to accept unfavorable terms. By framing resistance to such pressure as a defense of international law and Ukrainian sovereignty rather than personal obstinacy, Zelenskyy seeks to maintain the moral high ground in this diplomatic standoff. The media coverage of this tension reveals another dimension of the challenge. Leavitt's communication style, characterized by sharp retorts and unwavering loyalty to Trump, has made her a polarizing figure. Her youth, 27, and rapid rise in MAGA circles have added to the polarized reactions, with some seeing her as a fresh voice and others questioning her experience in handling complex diplomatic issues. Leavitt's handling of questions about Ukraine reflects broader patterns in her approach as press secretary. Her tenure has been marked by accusations of prioritizing narrative over evidence, which may erode trust in U.S. diplomatic communications. In one notable incident, she made a verbal mistake during a press conference, saying Trump had exuded effort in the Russia-Ukraine war instead of exerted, which was widely mocked online and raised questions about her command of the complex issues at stake. Such incidents, while seemingly minor, can impact diplomatic credibility, especially in high-stakes negotiations. For Zelenskyy, navigating this landscape requires balancing principled resistance with pragmatic engagement, all while maintaining domestic support for what might be difficult compromises. It's worth noting that the tension between Zelenskyy and Leavitt exists within a broader historical context. Ukraine has long sought to assert its sovereignty and European identity against Russian attempts to keep it within Moscow's sphere of influence. The current conflict represents not just a territorial dispute, but a clash between competing visions for Ukraine's future and for the post-Cold War European security architecture. The Trump administration's approach, as articulated by Leavitt, appears to prioritize great power politics and bilateral deals over the multilateral, rules-based order that has guided international relations since World War II. This shift has profound implications not just for Ukraine, but for how conflicts are managed globally. For ordinary Ukrainians, the statements from Leavitt that Zelenskyy labeled as dangerous represent not just diplomatic positioning, but potential threats to their security, sovereignty, and national identity. After enduring years of war, widespread destruction, and thousands of civilian casualties, the prospect of being pressured into concessions that reward aggression naturally evokes strong emotional and political resistance. As this diplomatic tension continues to evolve, several key indicators will signal its future direction. These include whether the Trump administration follows through on threats to reduce or condition military aid, whether European allies increase their support in response to U.S. pressure, and whether Russia responds to these developments by escalating military action or engaging more seriously in negotiations. The ultimate resolution of this tension will depend on multiple factors, including battlefield developments, domestic political considerations in both the U.S. and Ukraine, and the broader geopolitical landscape. Whatever the outcome, it will shape not just the future of Ukraine, but potentially the norms and principles that govern international relations in an increasingly multipolar world. In conclusion, the tension between Zelenskyy and Leavitt represents more than a diplomatic spat. It encapsulates fundamental questions about sovereignty, international law, and the responsibilities of powerful nations toward their allies. By labeling Leavitt's statements as dangerous, Zelenskyy is not merely expressing personal frustration, but highlighting the potential consequences of a shift in U.S. policy that could undermine Ukraine's position and set problematic precedents for international security. As this situation continues to unfold, it will require careful attention, not just from those directly involved, but from all who care about the principles that underpin the international order and the precedents being set for how conflicts are resolved in the 21st century. The statements exchanged between Kiev and Washington may seem like mere words, but in the high-stakes realm of wartime diplomacy, words can indeed be as dangerous or as constructive as actions. Thank you for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.